The day I buried my husband, I thought the worst pain of my life was already behind me. I believed that nothing could hurt more than standing beside his coffin, staring at the man I loved and knowing he would never open his eyes again. But I was wrong, because the real nightmare didn't begin with his death, it began with his family. My name is Emily, and until 3 months ago, I believed my life was simple and peaceful. I had a husband who loved me deeply, a small home filled with laughter, and a future that felt safe and certain. Daniel and I met when I was 26, during a time when my life was messy and uncertain. I had just ended a painful relationship and moved to a new city where I barely knew anyone. Daniel was quiet, thoughtful, and patient. He didn't try to impress me with big gestures. Instead, he showed up in small ways that mattered. He remembered things I said. He listened when I spoke. He stayed when things were difficult. 2 years later, we bought a small white house together on a quiet street with a maple tree in the front yard. It wasn't a mansion, but to us, it felt perfect. Daniel loved that tree. Every autumn, he would stand outside watching the leaves fall as if it were the most beautiful thing in the world. Sometimes he would smile and say, "Emily, this house is the start of everything." For a while, everything really was perfect. We built routines together, Sunday breakfasts, movie nights, quiet evenings on the porch. I truly believed our life would continue like that for decades. But one rainy Tuesday night, everything changed. Daniel left the house to pick up groceries. Before walking out the door, he kissed my forehead and said he'd be back in 20 minutes. Those were the last words he ever said to me. A drunk driver ran a red light, and in one violent moment, my world shattered. When the police officer arrived at my door later that evening, I already knew something terrible had happened before he even spoke. His face carried the kind of sadness you can't hide. I remember the words he said, but they sounded distant, like I was underwater. "Mrs. Carter, I'm very sorry." After that, everything blurred together. Hospital visits, paperwork, phone calls, and finally, the funeral. The day of the funeral felt cold and gray, like the sky itself was mourning. I stood beside Daniel's casket wearing a black dress that suddenly felt too heavy for my body. His face looked peaceful, almost as if he were simply sleeping. For a moment, I kept expecting him to sit up and smile at me the way he always did. But the silence remained. Across the room stood Daniel's parents, Richard and Margaret Carter. They looked sad, but there was something distant about them, something cold. His mother barely spoke to me. His father barely looked at me. At the time, I assumed grief affected everyone differently. I didn't realize their silence meant something else. After the funeral service ended, most people slowly drifted away until the cemetery grew quiet. I remained near Daniel's grave, staring at the fresh soil, trying to understand how my life had suddenly become unrecognizable. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. When I turned around, Daniel's father was standing there with his arms folded. Richard Carter had always been an intimidating man, tall, serious, and used to getting his way. He cleared his throat and spoke my name. "Emily." I wiped my tears and nodded politely, but the next words he said made my heart stop. "You'll need to start packing soon," he told me. At first, I thought I misunderstood him. I blinked and asked what he meant. Richard looked directly at me and said calmly, "That house belongs to the Carter family. Now that Daniel is gone, the property returns to Blood family." For a moment, I couldn't speak. My mind struggled to process what he was suggesting. "That house is my home," I said quietly. "Daniel and I bought it together." But Richard simply shook his head as if I were a child who didn't understand the rules. He claimed the land had originally belonged to their family and that I had no real claim to it now that Daniel was gone. Standing behind him, Margaret said nothing. She didn't defend me. She didn't question him. She simply watched. In that moment, something inside me cracked.
Not from grief, but from disbelief. They were discussing my home like it was a piece of furniture they planned to take back. But what they didn't know was that Daniel and I had quietly prepared for a moment like this. The weeks after Daniel's death were painfully quiet. Every room in the house reminded me of him. His jacket still hung by the door. His favorite coffee mug sat untouched in the cabinet. Some nights I woke up thinking I heard his footsteps in the hallway, but it was always just silence. 2 days after the funeral, Richard arrived at the house again. This time, he didn't bother with sympathy. He knocked loudly and walked inside as if he already owned the place. Margaret followed behind him while he looked around the living room with a critical expression. "This place needs to be cleared out," he said.
I felt anger rising in my chest. I told him I wasn't leaving. Richard responded by pulling a folder from his briefcase filled with property documents. He explained that the land had originally been purchased by him years ago and that Daniel had only been allowed to live there. The way he used the word allowed made my stomach twist. He informed me that I had 30 days to move out. Then he and Margaret walked out the door without another word. For the rest of that night, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the paperwork he left behind. Something didn't feel right. Daniel had always been extremely careful about finances and legal matters. I remembered something he once told me while we were discussing future plans. "If anything ever happens to me," he said gently, "don't panic. Everything is taken care of." At the time, I thought he was talking about insurance or savings, but now I wondered if he meant something more. I went upstairs into Daniel's small office. The room still smelled faintly like his cologne. For a moment, the grief hit me so strongly I almost turned around and left. But then I noticed the metal lockbox inside his desk drawer. I had seen it many times before, but never opened it. Taped beneath the drawer was a small envelope with my name written on it. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a key and a short note from Daniel. The note said that if I was reading it, something had gone terribly wrong, but I shouldn't be afraid because he had already taken care of everything. When I opened the lockbox, I found several documents neatly arranged inside. One of them made my heart race. It was a legally filed property transfer deed. Months before his death, Daniel had transferred full ownership of the house and land entirely into my name. Daniel knew his parents well. He understood exactly what they might try to do if something happened to him, and he made sure I would be protected. For the first time since the accident, I felt something stronger than grief. I felt determination. I didn't confront Richard immediately. Instead, I waited. Over the next 2 weeks, he continued calling and sending letters demanding I move out. Each time, I remained calm and polite, letting him believe I was powerless. That confidence made him careless. 3 weeks after the funeral, he arrived at my house again, this time with a moving truck and 2 hired movers. He stepped onto the porch with a satisfied smile, clearly convinced that he had already won. "Well, Emily, time's up." The movers approached the door, but I stepped forward and blocked their path. My voice was calm when I spoke. I told Richard he should have spoken to a lawyer before making assumptions. Then I handed him the official deed Daniel had left behind. As Richard read the document, the confident smile slowly disappeared from his face. His hands trembled slightly. He muttered that it couldn't be possible. But it was. Daniel had legally transferred the property to me months earlier. The house was mine. Richard tried to fight the decision in court, but the documents were flawless. Every signature, every record, every legal detail confirmed that Daniel had made the transfer long before his death. Within weeks, the court ruled in my favor. The house belonged to me completely. But the biggest consequence wasn't the legal defeat. It was the way Richard's behavior exposed his true character. Many relatives who once supported him began distancing themselves after hearing how he tried to remove his own son's grieving widow from her home. Even Margaret eventually stopped defending him. Months have passed since then. Autumn has returned, and the maple tree outside the house is glowing red and gold, just like Daniel loved. Sometimes I sit on the porch in the evening, watching the leaves fall and remembering the life we built together. I still miss him every day, and that pain will probably never fully disappear. But Daniel protected me in a way that continues even now. This house still holds his laughter, his memories, and his promise that I would always have a home. Richard tried to take that away from me, but he failed, because the truth has a quiet strength that greed can never defeat. And sometimes the people who believe you are weakest are the ones who end up discovering just how strong you really are.